Welcome back to the fifth part in our series, Soundesign Trendsetter 7, Case Disassembly. Today's episode is narrated by Greg Cochran. As always, we thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Welcome to the next installment in our series. For those of you that are new and haven't yet enjoyed my previous videos, be sure to check out my channel. There, you'll find my introduction to vintage novelty stereo repairs and the rest of this series on the Trendsetter 7. Before we get into the disassembly, here's a picture of what the Trendsetter looked like when it arrived. Take note that it's missing the base. For this part of the series, it was easier for me to document the process using a camera and still photos. For those of you that are interested in learning about the tools that you'll need to take one of these apart and how to get the electronics out, etc., all of that is covered in previous videos in the Trendsetter 7 series. So without further ado, let's tear this thing apart. After removing a few screws from the inside of the case, I was able to remove the main deck from the frame or stand part of the Trendsetter 7. This thing was so unstable without the base on it, all you had to do was brush against it and it was about to fall over. When beginning to disassemble one of these cases, it's important to be patient and just look everywhere for possible screws or fasteners that may be holding things together. Your best case scenario is to break the case down as much as possible, because when you get to the point where you're putting vinyl back on as a recover, it's a lot easier than having to do a lot of specialty measurements and cuts, which can result in a lot of wasted vinyl and material, and your time. Now we can put it up on the bench and see what it's going to take to break this portion down. You will definitely want to take extra care when removing the chrome pieces from the case. They're very thin. I usually joke that they're only a couple millimeters from aluminum foil. But the main thing is you don't want to kink them. If you get a kink in them, you're going to have to find something to replace them with because you'll never get them right again. They're only put in with hot glue, so usually something like a little chisel or a putty knife that you can get up underneath will help break these free. It just requires some patience, so take your time. As I mentioned in a previous video, this case arrived heavily colored with marker and crayon. This clearly was in somebody's basement or storage area and got attacked by a child. So it took a lot of cleaning. You don't want to have things like this left behind when you go to put your vinyl overlay or laminate back on to renew the case. So I used acetone to get most of this marker and crayon off, and I scrubbed it manually. Part of getting these cases ready for new vinyl is going to be getting the old glue and residue left behind from when you took the moldings off. I use a chisel, but any good scraping tool will do to get your case cleaned up and ready for vinyl. Here's a picture of the side of the deck, just to emphasize what I was working with and give you something to compare to when we get to the pictures where I've applied the new vinyl veneer. Whenever I work on a unit, I make a template of its parts. It's always handy to put something underneath of the opening, like where the record player goes or where the stereo head unit sits. These things can come in handy later if you ever want to recreate one, or, as in this case, I'm going to be changing the electronics out because by this stage we've discovered that they're not repairable. So after a record player repair, I went out and found a parts unit, and that head unit and the 8-track holder that came with it were a different shape. So we actually made a new top, and you'll see that later on in the video. So what I'll do in that case is before I make any changes to the top, I'll make a template so that if that customer ever comes across the original electronics and they want to reinstall them, I can send them another top finished with the same vinyl that will make it look new again. Next, it was onto the stand and getting the speaker panel removed. You can really tell what condition these things usually are. By the time I get to them and have the opportunity to restore them, most of them have been kept in horrible circumstances. A lot of these stopped working in the late 80s or mid 90s at the latest, and they ended up in damp places like basements or garages. So it's not really common, at least for me, to ever find one of these that don't have some level of damage to the case just from the surroundings they were kept in. Fortunately for me, the rest of this case broke down easily. I love before and after pictures of pieces like this, because this is a great example of how rough these original finishes can be and how easily you can really renew them with some simple vinyl veneer. Of course, you need to really learn the techniques, and that just comes with time and experience. And you have to be good with a razor blade. You have to be able to cut clean corners and clean lines. But when you're done, it's just amazing how nice these pieces look. In an instance like this, on the side panel, you may be tempted to pry off little pieces of wood and things that are used for the reassembly. It wouldn't be that hard to trace a line and just staple them back on when you're ready. But in this case, I was able to determine that the vinyl, as far as where it was going to be visible once the case was put back together, didn't really require me to take off this little piece. So you really want to pay attention and think out about what's going to be visible and what isn't, so you don't do unnecessary work. Also, pay attention to the bottom of this particular piece. You can see some more of that ugly swelling. All the pieces must be thoroughly cleaned. I use Windex, and sometimes I'll use acetone if it's a marker or a crayon mark like I showed you in the previous video and in the previous slide. But the other thing you'll need to do in some cases is take some sandpaper or actually an electric sander and smooth out some of these imperfections that have come about from the swelling of the wood. I've even trimmed off some of the wood in cases where the bottom was just too far gone. You can fix a lot of things with different fillers and whatnot. As long as you sand it down and put some primer on it and the vinyl will stick to it, you're good to go. Before removing the speakers, I always take a picture of how the wires are connected, just to make sure when I'm putting everything back together, and believe me, there are a million wires in some of these units. You just want to not get confused, and you want to remember how everything goes back together. That way the machine's going to operate, to its peak performance. Removing the speakers and the wires that have probably been connected to those speakers over the last 45 years, this is a good time to take some sandpaper and clean those terminals before you put the wires back on. As I mentioned earlier in the slideshow, the speaker panel was really boogered up at the bottom. I went ahead and took some sandpaper, and you'll see in the next slide I really sanded off the rough spots on the end and thoroughly cleaned this surface because, spray paint you can do, but on this type of wood it always looks horrible. So I took the time to clean this real well. I primered it, and I eventually put black vinyl over this. After all the parts have been separated and thoroughly cleaned and prepped for vinyl, it's time to start cutting the vinyl pieces. I always cut my pieces a little large because you want that overhang. That way you can dip in with your razor blade when you go to trim the vinyl, and you'll get a nice straight edge along the piece. You'll get a perfect cut every time. This also allows, if you put it on slightly crooked one way or the other, you can get all the way to the other end and still have the vinyl be fully covering the project. Here is a side-by-side comparison of what a difference the vinyl makes compared to the original. Now, unfortunately, the original Soundesign 7 did have more of a silver tone to it than the tone that I chose with the vinyl. But the reality is, all of the vinyl out on the market, when you start going into silvers, you either get into metallics or you get into stainless steel, which looks way too modern for something that was built in the 70s. Honestly, once this whole unit was finished with all of this vinyl, it looks original to anyone that would look at it. It's important to realize that the vinyl gets a little trickier the longer the piece is. It takes a lot of patience, and you put it on a little at a time. For those of you that have never worked with vinyl, it's definitely not the sort of thing you just remove the entire backing and you stick the sticker on. You do it a little at a time, and I use a Bondo, I guess it's a putty knife. It's plastic. You can buy them in a 3-pack at Harbor Freight, but those won't damage the vinyl, and they help get any air pockets out and give you a good smooth adhesion to the project as you're putting the vinyl on. The rest is all about patience with your razor blade work. Here you can see some tricky angles and even a little semicircle there towards the middle, up towards the top there you'll see. But all of that can be done just with a good razor blade. And I will say that, the razor blades dull out a lot quicker than you realize. So I always change mine out at the first sign that they're binding up on my vinyl. After some careful trim work, this piece turned out way better than expected. You might remember it earlier in the slideshow. I pointed out this really was one of the ugliest pieces that came out of this unit. Here, it looks pretty new, if I should say so myself. After the vinyl work is complete, it's time to reassemble the case. Take note in this picture that the top is not refinished at all, no vinyl, it's original. Keep in mind, as we talked about earlier, that I'm going to be putting basically a faceplate on top of that with vinyl to put the new electronics in. In this picture, I've cut the inlay for the top, and I've also began to set the base down just to get kind of a visual check on how it looked. In this picture, I've yet to take my router and cut in my slot joints for the T-molding, nor have I primered it. Here's a closer look of the slot for the T-molding after I've used my router. You can also take note in this picture how clean the speaker hole looks there in black. That's the new vinyl. Now it was time to apply primer to all the unfinished pieces in preparation for the vinyl applique. At this stage, from inside and underneath, I used a pencil to trace out the outline of the record player. After cutting out the tracing of the record player area, I used a partial template that I had made from the parts unit, and I used that to transpose the image for the new electronics and the 8-track holder to fit in properly. Next, it was on to vinyl. The last thing I had to do to complete this stage was cut the slot at the bottom of the base for the new T-molding. For those of you who are interested, I've also included a picture of the parts unit that I purchased off of Craigslist that I sourced the head unit and the 8-track holder from. It was a Trendsetter 1000. Now when I purchased it, the on and off button didn't work, and the 8-track player was completely broken and the record player was frozen. Fortunately, I was able to fix the on and off problem, and I was also able to fix the 8-track. And as far as the turntable went, I was able to get a few parts of it for this project. I'll also mention that this picture you're looking at here is not the actual unit, that's just the model. The one that I got had the plastic over the light organ was busted, the case was swollen and really in bad condition overall, and as we talked about before, that the electronics didn't quite work. But it's still a good unit for me to get the templates from, as I mentioned earlier, and for that it serves a good purpose. The next video in this series will be covering the 8-track repair that I did on this unit. This will be a must-watch video for anyone that has their own 8-track player. If you'd like to attempt a repair, if you just want to do a little bit of maintenance, I'm going to break it down for you. I'll even include a proprietary repair that I do to the plastic cradle that holds the 8-track head. Most professionals will tell you this is not repairable. Don't listen to them, folks. Watch the video. I'll show you how to do it. If it's too tedious, you can send me the cradle itself and I can make the repair for you, or you can send me your whole unit and I can service it. And as always, you can contact me through 70s Collectibles on Facebook. As always, if you found this video entertaining or helpful, please hit that like button, please subscribe, and as always, I thank you for watching and I hope to see you on the next video.